Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and tonight we're pleased to host Dr. Evan Ellis. Dr. Ellis holds a doctorate in comparative politics from Purdue University, and he is a research professor of Latin American studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. His focus is on the Central and South America with an additional emphasis on China and other non-Western actors within the Western Hemisphere. He also looks at transnational organizations in organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Ellis has published over 250 works, including his 2018 book on transnational organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Ellis previously served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. In his academic capacity, Dr. Ellis presented his work in a broad range of business and governmental forums in 27 countries over 4 continents. He has given testimony on Latin American security issues to the U.S. Congress on various occasions, has discussed his work regarding China and other external actors in Latin America on a broad range of radio and television programs, and is cited regularly in the print media in both the U.S. and Latin America for his work in the area. Good evening, Dr. Ellis. I understand the camera is almost exclusively focused on you, so we're fine. So, sir, the floor is yours.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you. I thank AHEC for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you this evening. Thank all of you for coming and for your time. Again, as was indicated, I've followed the region, Latin America and the Caribbean for about 16 years now in a range of different capacities. And as we've all watched and worked through the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, it's impacted, first of all, China as it's unfolded over the year. It's impacted Europe. And then, of course, we are now really in the thick of impacts in the United States and unfortunately the continuing impacts with reopenings and spikes, etc. But Latin America and the Caribbean is also finally seeing COVID really take off in the region with some very, very serious effects, indeed effects that may ultimately be more significant than even the effects that we are facing here in the United States. And in some ways, effects that will gravely impact not only the region's security situation, but also that of the United States, insofar as that we here are connected to what happens in the region in terms of our security and our prosperity through geographic ties, through economic ties with U.S. companies, through ties of immigration and family, through ties that really span a broad range of things. Because what happens in the region impacts us. In my capacity as our Latin America research professor, what I'm going to talk about tonight is what's going on with COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean, how that's impacting the strategic environment and what that means for us. I'll try to talk for about 45 minutes, and then after that, leave the floor open. Hopefully you will have some questions, which I will be very happy to answer. I should emphasize that in my capacity as a Army Title X civilian working for the Strategic Studies Institute of the War College, everything that I say is purely my own opinion and in no way represents the War College or the U.S. government. So I'm going to start by sharing a screen from my presentation here. So bear with me just a minute to get us through the technology. You are hopefully now seeing a slide that says the impact of COVID-19 on the strategic environment in Latin America and the Caribbean. Is that what everyone is seeing? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes.
Okay. As I indicated before, in the world now approaching 11 million cases with over 500,000 deaths. Of course, we're very focused on what's happening in the US, approaching 3 million cases. But it's interesting to note that Latin America right now, which was late to see COVID take off in many ways because it is not as connected in terms of human ties to China and to Europe, is now starting to see the virus take over with a vengeance. If you look at the numbers, you'll actually see that the total for Latin America and the Caribbean of COVID cases and deaths is almost the same as what it is for the United States, and things are getting worse quickly. So Latin America accounts for about a quarter of the COVID cases currently in the world. Brazil alone, which is about half of the population of Latin America and the economy of, South America, has itself 14% of all of the cases in the world. Behind the United States, it's the largest single country in terms of COVID cases. Beyond that, Peru, a very serious situation there. Chile, despite its prosperity, a lot of different cases. Mexico. And what you also see is the difference in public policy across cases. So, for example, when we look at the numbers for Mexico, noting that Chile and Mexico have a roughly similar number of cases, it's striking to note that the number of deaths in Mexico is 5 times that of Chile. So as this unfolds, public policy does matter. You also see other cases of concern, for example, Venezuela, where although it seems to have a modest 6,750 cases, at least reported, and although the actual number is far higher, that number literally has doubled in the past 2 weeks. And with Venezuela's almost absent health system and almost absent medical sanitation and masks and things like that, the implications for COVID really taking off in Venezuela for the rest of the region, with the almost 6 million refugees going out from Venezuela to the region, are absolutely catastrophic. So what I want to show through this slide right here, and don't worry, I'm not going to go into the details, but you do have access if you want to go back and take a greater look later, is that what is often missed, why things seem to be getting so bad so quickly in Latin America, is it's not just the pandemic itself. You have an interaction between health dynamics, public policy dynamics, economic dynamics, public security and crime dynamics, protest and political change dynamics, and the way in which those things all reinforce each other. Each one, in many ways, and right now in Latin America, is making things worse and more extended. Not unlike what we're seeing here in the United States, but even more worrisomely so. And I'll try to explain that through the following slides. So first of all, let me take one core point I want to make in Latin America is that despite what has been the common wisdom up until just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the health impacts on Latin America and the Caribbean are probably going to be a lot more prolonged and a lot more lethal than many people have realized. And there's a whole range of reasons for this that I'll talk about right here. First of all, in Latin America, basically social culture does matter. You have a basically cultural affinity to interact socially in ways that are arguably different than what we are used to in the West and different than other places. To give you a counterexample, it's interesting for the population density in Japan, the number of COVID cases in Japan has been remarkably low. In part, that has to do with Japanese propensity for social interaction. And so in part, the culture of social interaction and personal contact, if you know Latin America, one kiss on the cheek, 2 kisses on the cheek, hugs, a comfort with close proximity, that works against one in terms of virus transmission, especially when it's transmitted, as COVID-19 is, by aerosol, among other means. Also, the economic structure in the region works against the situation. In that, first of all, you have very large informal sectors. So, for example, in Peru, as many as 70% of the people who work in Peru are in informal economy. With respect to economic structure, what you find then is that where we in the United States have the luxury of working from home, having these wonderful Zoom and Microsoft Teams interactions as we're doing now, there's a relatively large proportion of the in Latin America, especially the informal sector, where that's just not possible. You have to interact. You have to go out and sell goods on the streets to make a living. And you can't just shutter yourself in for 2 or 3 or 4 months, because if you do, you don't eat. And frankly, you also have a very vulnerable small and medium-sized enterprise sector, which again is very fragile. And so many of the businesses, the small businesses, even the formal ones in Latin America, can't afford to be shuttered for very long, or they simply disappear. What you also have, for those of you who know the region, is various different types of public markets, which are especially in the middle class and lower class, is really a part of the tradition of most parts of the region. But public markets in terms of lots of people in close proximity, fresh meats, fresh vegetables, lots of touching, lots of handling. The proximity and sanitation dynamics of public markets are terrible for spreading, highly contagious viruses. And so in Peru, which has a super wonderful public market tradition, you have, one of the most rapid takeoffs of COVID-19 in the region. And so part of the pressure that you have from the need of people to interact, the need of people to not be shuttered down too long, is you have this spiral of, as we have in the United States, partial economic reopenings, a lot of political pressure to open the economy back up, but that makes the virus harder to control, etc. That's compounded by the fact that Latin America, if we in the United States do not have resources to do wide-scale testing to know who in your trusted circle may have COVID or not, in Latin America, much less so, especially certain countries, let alone detailed good contact tracing. In addition to that, in Latin America, as in the United States, we have significant delays in developing an effective vaccine. Even if the vaccine is developed, in the United States, we're looking at maybe early 2021, possibly mid-2021. The amount of time actually to get that mass produced and out to Latin American publics, we could be talking the end of 2021, and even then a vaccine that only may have 50% efficacy or more. Also, winter in the southern cone is approaching. Argentina, in Uruguay, in the south of Chile, which really, again, that tends to compound virus propagation. Although at the same time, COVID-19 is resilient in tropical condition. If that weren't enough, you have the dynamics of refugee populations. And so if you think about, for example, Venezuelans, you have a very worrisome dynamic in which right now you have many Venezuelans who have been about 6 million who've gone out to the rest of the region. But when the COVID-19 crisis shut everything down in public spaces in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, those Venezuelans started coming home because they just couldn't live off of the informal economy with COVID, in the other countries. And, sadly, in many cases, preferring to risk things at home rather than risk things abroad where they had, limited resources. But what has been happening then is you have Venezuelans traveling in unsanitary conditions, in a weakened state, oftentimes working in close proximity in refugee camps as they gather on the Colombia side of the Colombia-Venezuelan border. And as they come back to the greater Caracas area, the prospect for those Venezuelans basically to take contamination from the rest of the region, contaminate those not already contaminated in the greater Caracas area, and as COVID-19 could take off in Venezuela, where, as you may very well know, you have an abysmal state of hospitals with lack of water, lack of cleaning fluids, lack of sanitary gel, lack of face masks, lack of basic sterilizing chemicals, lack of ventilators. The implications then are just catastrophic. In addition to that, of course, you have other border regions in Central America, in the Haiti-Dominican border, and in various other regions where you conditions with refugees being a transmission vector for COVID. In addition to that, what you also have is some countries, especially where this already dangerous situation is made even worse by political leaders who have either delayed shutting things down for economic or other reasons, or have not taken the virus seriously. So the public health system in Mexico was basically dismantled by the incoming regime of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The new system was not fully in place when COVID hit. AMLO, as he is called, was slow to also really start shutting down things in Mexico. And you're starting to see that in the numbers in Mexico right now. Of course, Brazil goes without saying. Jair Bolsonaro, who himself literally just yesterday contracted COVID after famously going around in public without a mask. We're seeing that Brazil is by and far, not only for its population, but also infection rate, one of the worst hit countries. In addition to some of these problems, and these all suggest that the virus will keep spreading and being transmitted, it'll be very hard to get this under control and go back down. But even as it spreads, it will also be more lethal. First of all, because the public health systems in Latin America and their coordination with the private health systems are notoriously weak. In addition to that, again, in many places in Latin America, although some of the big city hospitals do have equipment, and they've done better as they've had time to see others in Europe and the United States react and receive equipment to help them. But when you look at remote areas in Latin America, even in countries such as Brazil, relatively sophisticated, but some of the states in the Northeast, some of the Amazon areas, Manaus and beyond, very few hospitals and clinics that really have effective capabilities to treat COVID. and we understand the importance, if it's a case of COVID-19, of being on a ventilator to basically because your lungs fill up with fluid, or at least high flow oxygen. If you don't get that, it's the difference between having a case and having a case that you never recover from. And if that weren't enough, one of the things that's happening right now is the exhaustion of state resources. As you recall, in the United States, when we first had the outbreak here, and really in much of the region, including Peru and elsewhere, you really had an opening of the checkbook. Okay, we'll worry about the deficits and debts later, but right now, just spend everything that we need to respond to the pandemic and to respond to the economic costs. Well, the problem is that when you think that you're only going to be dealing with a pandemic for a month or 2 months or maybe 3 months, it's okay to keep the checkbook open. But in Latin America, whose economies are generally not based on dollars, and who already have severe constraints in terms of their fiscal situation, you just can't keep borrowing and borrowing forever. And so what we're starting to see is right now, Latin American governments are starting to make hard decisions. First of all, pulling money away from other important public health and public activities, but also over the long run, finding themselves limited in what they can do economically as well as what they can do in terms of public health to continue to fight the COVID crisis. So again, those limits in spending will also have effects in terms of lethality. So the first real key point that I wanted to make here is that you're likely to see literally in Latin America this dragging out through 2021, maybe even late 2021 with no end in sight. And that's going to have a significant impact on the region. Now, as you recognize, as the health crisis goes on, that has direct impacts on the economy. Already we've seen the numbers for expected economic decline in Latin America really just keep getting worse and worse. The latest figure, which I believe is from the World Bank, is an expected 9.4% decline overall for the coming year. Now, that's given the fact that the first half of the year was actually okay for Latin America. So that means that the second half of the year is likely to be continued decline. In addition, we already see some really significant effects in particular countries. So in the second quarter of this year in Peru, as things started taking off, a 40% decline in GDP. Other countries are similar. Mexico overall for the year is expected to lose more than 10%. And frankly, I expect that even though the World Bank's at a 9.4% decline right now, by the end of the year, we're going to see double-digit declines predicted probably for the region as a whole. Now, as the crisis drags out, remember, there's a difference between temporary shuttering of businesses from which you can bounce back and long-term effects that if you allow things to go too long, businesses tend to disappear, effects tend to become permanent. So, one of the things I emphasize here is, on the one hand, across Latin America, you're seeing dramatic increases in needed spending for the public health response itself, for the security component, and for curfews and things like that, and medical logistics. In addition, the need the economic and social programs to cover the people who are put out of work, or the people in the informal sector who need money to basically continue to eat while their economic opportunities gone away. So lots of things that push government expenses through the roof. At the same time, that state revenues in Latin America are falling to the floor. So on the one hand, the traditional export markets for most of Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, the United States and the European Union, as the situation here has been extremely depressed, our demand for Latin American products, especially manufactured products, has just been terrible. How many people are buying cars right now? And what does that do, for example, to the export-oriented Mexican manufacturing sector, or the maquiladora sector in Mexico, or the manufacturing sector for garments in China, Latin America, or in Central America under CAFTA, for example. So we're all here no longer going out in our suits every day, and so the new culture of t-shirt and jeans, or worse, with the Zoom culture, people are just not buying dress-up garments right now, and that affects Central America as it affects U.S. demand. Just to give an example. In addition to that, you see other things like, again, the closure of businesses in Latin America, which hurts government tax revenue, the fall in commodity prices. Oil prices, as we know, are at record lows, which hurts Latin American oil exporters, such as Ecuador, such as Venezuela, such as Mexico, among others. In addition to that, other commodity prices, so iron, etc., copper hurts commodity exporters such as Chile, such as Peru, etc. So Latin America, their governments, huge increase in expenditures, huge decrease in money coming in, and you know that that combination means that you have a big problem, obligating spending cuts in other areas. Now, part of that, certain governments who are on constrained budgets. So, for example, Ecuador right now, who is on a very strict International Monetary Fund program to basically keep its budget balanced, has significant problems because it needs to make severe cuts to stay on track. Argentina, as many of you know, is looking at trying to negotiate with its creditors to write down some of its debt as it faces this crisis. Now, in some cases, as governments become financially stressed, that creates opportunities, as I'll talk about later, for the People's Republic of China. So, for example, in Mexico right now, where the government of AMLO, as I mentioned, is trying to do this response without borrowing a whole lot of money from the West. Certain key projects that are important to AMLO, for example, his signature Maya train, a train that will go through the isthmus in the south and east of Mexico. Right now, there's a Chinese company in the project. And at the end of the day, it's very likely that Mexico will have to turn to Chinese financing as Western financing remains frozen to keep that alive. Or, for example, the Mexican oil company, Pemex. So, again, AMLO, because of his public policies, has been very reluctant to invite in U.S. or other Western oil companies to invest directly in the oil sector, wanting to do everything with Pemex. But with oil prices so low, Pemex just doesn't have the money, and the Mexican state needs to use its money in other places. Now, in Brazil, in 2008, who came in to loan the Brazilian state oil company, Petrobras, money? But China, about $10 billion in 2009. And so in Mexico, a very similar thing. China offered Pemex about $5 billion in loans about 4 years ago. At the time, the government of Enrique Peña Nieto turned it down. But it's very possible that as AMLO gets desperate, again, offers of things like this, loans to Pemex, loans to for Train Maya, or even loans to distressed, politically sympathetic governments like the new government of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in Argentina. Those could be tempting inroads for a desperate government to open the door to Chinese loans and Chinese deals. The other thing that I worry about in terms of the economy in the region is, again, the degree to which the temporary shuttering of businesses, the temporary staying at home, these things become permanent. Because, again, governments have very limited resources in Latin America to protect businesses and continue to subsidize them. They just can't do what we're doing here in the United States. The businesses go week after week after week with no customers and no government subsidies. The businesses, frankly, go away. They go into bankruptcy if they can't be protected. And so what we're looking at is the prospect of an entire segment of the Latin American middle class could fall back into poverty. An entire segment of Latin American manufacturing could disappear over the next couple months. And that will have a permanent impact on the economic character and inequality and frankly, suffering in the region. In addition, what we're seeing is that you have some also possibilities for China. Because if you are a garment producer, for example, in Central America, or if you are a component producer for the auto sector, if you go out of business or if you can't make the production, then the person who is the buyer says, okay, well, I've lost the supplier. Who do I have? Well, I can order it through Alibaba in China, or I can, there's a Chinese company that is willing to do this. And so one of the things that I expect to see is that the going out of business of small and medium-sized businesses in Latin America will open up new opportunities for China in Latin American supply chains. And that will continue to push forward what we call the deindustrialization or the reprimaritization of Latin America, the increasing dependence on primary products. And finally, what this means over the long term, especially with decreased government budgets, is that already bad state performance in Latin America is likely to get worse. In other words, when Latin American governments, already inefficient, run out of money, so their ability to respond to growing unemployment, health issues, crime, public security, this is just not going to be there. which means that you will see what you already begun to see in October and November of 2019, which is frustrated Latin American publics rebelling against poor government performance, and protesting in the street, demanding different political leadership, demanding different political change. Now, this leads me to my next one of the things that I can expect to see, probably not immediately, because immediately things look deceptively better in Latin America. Why? Because with people going inside and staying socially distanced for COVID, you take a lot of the things that were related to common crime off the streets, the nightclubs, the other interactions, the public gatherings. However, with the return to social interaction, which is almost inevitable, as I've mentioned, what you're going to see is a combination of almost a perfect storm. You will have a larger number, as I just mentioned, of desperate people across the region, people who used to be middle class or at least solvent, who have seen their informal sector opportunities or their regular jobs dry up. Add to that the fact that many families in Latin America, especially in the middle and especially lower classes, would depend on remittances. You're probably familiar with this, people, especially in Mexico and Central America, significant, sometimes up to 15% of the entire GDP of the region coming from basically people who, family members who work in the United States, family members who work in Europe and send part of their income back home. But as those basically marginal workers, informal sector workers in the United States have seen their opportunities dry up, their ability to send remittances back home to El Salvador, to Guatemala, to Honduras, to Mexico has also gone away, which means that the most vulnerable in Latin America, already put out of jobs, already seeing their informal opportunities dry up, are now also seeing themselves cut off from the one thing that used to keep them, hanging on. And to make matters worse, of course, frontiers, borders are now closed in Latin America to fight the public health issue as never before, which means that those who previously, when they got really desperate, would migrate, to the United States, etc. Migration for the moment is not available as a safety valve. So the amount of just sheer desperation in the coming months and year in Latin America is likely to just really take off. Beyond that, let me say a few other things about some of the criminal groups and how actually COVID-19 affects criminal groups. First of all, in places like Central America, where you have gangs like Mara Salvatrucha, Barrio 18, as well as the militias that sometimes were organized to combat them but fell themselves into violence. The good news or bad news is that it's not easy to be a gang in COVID-19 times. The income that gangs used to live off of, from the nightclubs that they owned or extorted, from the taxis that they would extort going through their neighborhoods, from the buses that they would extort, all of that. The nightclubs are closed. The taxis aren't coming through the neighborhoods, as are the buses. The local businesses that they used to extort don't have the money that they used to because the economy's dried up. And so you have gangs getting increasingly desperate, turning to different revenue streams, which will increase violence. At the same time, in places like Brazil, for example, the favelas, the marginal neighborhoods of places like Rio de Janeiro, what you also see is that the gangs who have always controlled the neighborhoods to some degree are taking advantage of COVID-19 to increase their social control. So, for example, in favelas Rio, you see, for example, the gangs playing a role in distributing medical supplies and personal protective equipment, gangs taking a role in enforcing curfews and things like that. In so many ways, COVID-19, ironically, makes the gangs more desperate, but also reinforces the control that they've long had over their neighborhoods, where the police are pulled away because they're running around doing other things, trying to support the public health response. Transnational organized crime. Important to point out that there's lots of different things that have been shaken up that we don't pay a lot of attention to by COVID. Number one is that a lot of the synthetic drugs and some of the worst new drugs, there were significant supply interruptions.
So as you recall, everything coming out of China was shut down in January, February, March. Now, if there was one beneficial impact, that meant that the worst of the worst current drugs, that's a scourge in the United States, fentanyl, which was coming out of China, for a time was shut off. Now, unfortunately, there was still enough fentanyl in the pipeline that didn't have that much of an effect on consumption. Same thing with precursor chemicals for drugs like methamphetamines. So ephedrine, pseudoephedrine, and related chemicals, there was a tightening of supply. In the illegal mining section, you have, for example, difficulties in getting basic supplies to informal mining, including chemicals like mercury. But especially for the narco traffickers, think about, again, what's happened with the COVID-19 related border closures. As there's less and less commerce to smuggle goods across borders, as there's less and less people traveling across borders that you can use as drug mules, that means that the movement of drugs and also other things like human trafficking get more difficult. Now, the criminal groups are adapting. They, for example, are using more narco subs, they're using more private watercraft, but still, it's really shaken up the criminal dynamic. Now, on the other hand, you do see more opportunities for other types of criminal activities that were always there, but not there to the degree you have now. So, as you probably already recognize, Latin America, like the United States, but even more so, has really thrown open the checkbook. What that's meant, though, is that when you say you're going to spend a lot of money really quickly with minimal checks and balances and oversight, you just open the door for the corruption you've always had in Latin America. And you're already beginning to see some of the pushback and the effects. And so just a couple of weeks ago, for example, the health minister of Bolivia was arrested for basically an overpayment scheme for, I believe, medical ventilators. There are opportunities at the local level to extort COVID-19 aid as it comes into neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. As people have gone more online and worked from home to the extent that they can, of course, there are lots of opportunities for cybercrime because people are moving into these spaces without some of the appropriate electronic protections that they have. In prisons, basically one of the core parts of the organized crime dynamic in family, prisons have become incubators in Latin America, which means that you are seeing expanded COVID-19 among prison populations and among criminal groups, but you're also seeing an accelerated tendency to try to release prisoners who are not there for serious crimes, which in many ways takes people who are already infected and puts them back out into the population, but making things worse, people who have criminal priors. Security forces in Latin America, of course, are really hard-pressed to cope with all these different things. One of the problems, of course, is right now they're being asked to do a lot of COVID-19 related things, enforcing curfews, shutting down borders, even manufacturing masks in some cases, and taking a lot of those resources out of hide. And so, in many ways, a lot of things that the security forces are being asked to do for COVID-19 takes away resources and time that they have to do these organized crime activities. And oh, by the way, especially with police forces and others, the risk of contamination from close community policing means that it makes it harder really to get close to the population to really do an effective job like is required in the current circumstances. Which gets us to protests and political change. So very quickly, as many of you recall, October 2019, you had a wave of political protests across Latin America. Started out in Ecuador with protests that transformed that country, later in Chile, which forced the government of Sebastián Piñera to do some pretty unprecedented things. Colombia to a lesser degree. That got shut off a little bit by the end of the year. However, as you may recall, a big driver of this protest was citizen frustration with government performance. Now, as we return from social isolation to greater and greater social interaction, and we're already seeing this across the region, as well as, of course, in the United States, that if there were sources of frustration with bad government performance in Latin America before, you have huge frustration now. So think of it that people who are frustrated in Brazil and elsewhere that the government was too slow to close the economy, causing people to die. Other people who are frustrated that the government is not reopening the economy fast enough. Other people who are frustrated because of the corruption in the diversion of COVID-19 funds, as I just mentioned. Other people who are frustrated because too many people have died because the public health system was inefficient and corrupt. Other people who are increasingly frustrated because unemployment rates skyrocketing for reasons that I explained before. Other people are frustrated because the government is not doing enough to protect the millions of informal sector workers who now have no way to sustain themselves. Other people who are upset because, crime and criminal groups are starting to expand for reasons that I just explained. Other people who are upset because, again, as I just explained, as the government has to cut back, you have severe cuts in government services and thus government performance. And so just about every reason you could imagine for people to be upset with their government and get out on the street and protest, you're going to have on an order of magnitude greater in the post-COVID environment, which again is going to mean a lot of sources for political change. Oh, by the way, you have, again, an expanded role, as I mentioned before, of Chinese companies probably coming into the region, combined with mistrust of those Chinese companies. And even now, you're beginning to see some of these protests. Protests in El Salvador over the Bukele government's handling of some of the quarantine centers and appropriation of powers, over the management of budget cuts in Ecuador, in Santiago and Chile. I mentioned May, but literally just yesterday you had some major violent protests in Santiago. Again, it just goes on and on. And I believe it's only going to get worse. And at the same time, you also have different opportunities for political change. Now, thus far, Latin America has not voted for huge political change. We just had an important election in the Dominican Republic, which had been postponed, in which a relatively pro-business person, Luis Abinader, although the incumbents got thrown out, it wasn't a radical change. And in St. Kitts also a vote for continuity. But as we look later in the year, the prospect for the left of center MAS to come back with Arce in Bolivia. As you look at Trinidad and Tobago elections in September, Belize in November, the prospect for Venezuelan elections, which may or may not occur, a referendum in Chile. And amidst all of this, it's not just that people are upset. People have now seen with the COVID pandemic that their very concept of what they expect government to do has now changed. I would say that prior to COVID-19, one of the things that was really important in the region was economic performance and to a lesser extent security. Security from crime and things like that. COVID-19 has really caused people to reevaluate what they expect from their government and the level to which they're willing to sacrifice, I would argue, some personal liberty, some democratic rights and freedom. Frankly and frighteningly, for a lot of people, authoritarian governments and China's response to COVID doesn't look entirely bad, given that China saved lives and appears to be getting back on its feet. Now, we'll see how that plays out, but the point of all of this is that it's not just about a lot of people upset with elections coming up. It's about people fundamentally rethinking what they expect of their government. So I see a lot of prospects for political change in the coming year or year and a half. Let me mention very briefly as well, China's advance in the region. It's very likely that you'll see that on the one hand, the PRC, which of course was the start of the virus in Wuhan, we've heard a lot about that and be happy to talk about it in Q&A. The virus has largely been under control in the PRC. It's expected that China will be one of the few major countries in the world that ends the year on positive economic growth. There are always risks, yes, that China will falter. I mentioned a few, obviously, that the possibility that a new part of the virus takes off. We've seen some worry about that in Beijing and one of the markets. You've seen the prospect of weak Western demand could hurt the Chinese economy. Contagion from a Western financial crisis could actually hit the PRC very hard because of its high debt loads, etc. But at the end of the day, right now, it actually appears that all of the bad things that could happen, China has a good case for holding it together better than some others. And if that indeed does happen, if things don't get really bad in China, or at least less bad than in Latin America and elsewhere, what we can actually expect to see is that, number one, China will become one of the even more trade for Latin America. already in terms of China's agricultural purposes. The Chinese still need to eat. And so Brazilian exports of soy, even during China's worst moments, were actually expanding, up by about 11% year on year to China. China, as I mentioned before, will continue to advance in Latin America and in other value chains as its competitors in the region go out of business or just can't fill orders. China will find that a lot of Western companies are looking to sell off distressed assets, get out of, basically sell off assets that they have in the oil industry, sell off assets that they have in mining, basically to concentrate more on the Chinese market to share up their economic position. So ironically, as US, European, and other Western companies try to basically get rid of Latin American assets to shore up their economic position, who is going to advance in Latin America but China, whose companies are relatively stronger and more, have greater access to cash and loans, at least at the moment. What that then implies is a significant increase over the next year to 2 years in the physical presence of Chinese company in Latin America. Just like after the 2008 financial crisis, you saw a major expansion in about 2010 in China's presence in the region. And what happened after 2010? The Chinese companies who were new to the region had a lot of the problems as they tried to figure out what to do. You're going to have the same thing this time, but even more so. So you're going to have a bigger Chinese footprint, but you're going to have a lot more tension between Chinese and local firms, especially because the economic situation in Latin America will just be so bad that people will be extra resentful as the Chinese come in as the new owners, especially with some of their notoriously clumsy management practices. In addition to that, of course, you have other reasons why people are already disposed to mistrust the Chinese, especially local competitors. You will have increasingly desperate, radical, frustrated labor forces, angry that they are not getting employed by the Chinese in the numbers that they expect. And so, again, I think we're going to have really a significant expansion of the PRC position in Latin America, but that is going to come with also increased intention. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the region, I think even more so than it has played out in recent years. Just very briefly, of course, as you do recognize, China has engaged in a very significant global effort for medical diplomacy to kind of win hearts and minds by saying, okay, we're donating things to help the region with respect to COVID. And in some cases, Chinese have actually donated significantly more than the United States. We've donated about $112 million to the region, although the amount of private sector funding that's gone to the region has been much, much greater. However, when you look China versus the United States, you do actually find that in some cases, so for example, in Mexico, where the Chinese actually donated more ventilators than the United States did, or in Panama, where again, they donated almost 8 times as many masks as the United States did. And these are kind of unfair comparisons, but the bottom line is that the Chinese have made a pretty real effort. Now, my sense, though, is over the long term, because the distrust of China and the Chinese are relatively clumsy with their donations, that the Chinese medical diplomacy will not probably have a lasting effect by comparison to how Chinese companies operate on the ground in the months to come. There are probably some important things. So, for example, when the U.S. pulled out of the World Health Organization, or at least announced its intention to do so, and the Chinese offered to come in with a $2 billion donation of their own, some of the institutional advances the Chinese could make could be some of the most important medical diplomacy things that they do. But that is yet to be seen how that plays out. The other big deal is who really first successfully develops and markets and distributes a vaccine across Latin America. Because PPE, personal protective gear, only gets you so far. But if the Chinese actually beat the United States to developing and deploying a vaccine and getting it free to Latin American publics, again, the impact of that on China, Latin America relations could be enormous. Very briefly, I just want to mention Taiwan. As you recognize, as you know, 9 countries in the region recognize Taiwan. Taiwan actually did a pretty decent job in the short term in helping its friends and partners, countries like Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Haiti, with their needs. The problem is, though, over the long term, Taiwan the amount of desperation, the need for access to major markets will vastly outweigh what credit you get for medical diplomacy. And so what worries me is, for example, in a country like Paraguay, where they received a lot of good medical equipment in the current crisis from Taiwan. But over the long term, Paraguay already trades 50 times more with the PRC, which it doesn't recognize, than with Taiwan, which it does. And so, just pressures to say, okay, well, we desperately need access to the Chinese market for Paraguayan beef, and so maybe we should change. And so I think you're actually going to see that with the new DPP government in Taiwan, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the PRC to really continue to push the aggressive diplomatic fight. And in that context, the sheer Latin American need for access to the PRC markets is going to make it really hard for Taiwan to compete. So Taiwan, good in the short term, but over the long term, I have some concerns. So again, I've covered a lot of space very quickly, happening in the region, and touching on how this will also affect China's position in the region. But again, do recall, if you remember, the children migrants as far back as 2014, or the migrants we've seen more recently, or the impact on tourism in the region, or the impact on the number of companies, U.S. companies, that have Latin American operations or Latin American investors. And so to the extent to which you have high crime, unemployment, et cetera, in Latin America, it directly impacts the United States through migrants, through public health flows, through impacts to U.S. companies operating in the region, through ungoverned spaces, which impact organized crime and drugs and things like that. So again, what happens in the region does impact us, and so ironically, in November 2020, in just a couple months, we are going to face, just as things really get bad in Latin America, a fundamental choice, which is largely, how does the United States react to Latin America, among other parts of the world? Do we react in a way to say things are getting unbelievably bad, we need to build unprecedented barriers to wall ourselves off from this? Or do we say, we need to engage with the region in unprecedented ways, or some combination of both? I don't want to make this political, but for me, it is fascinating that the choices that we make in terms of our presidential election will likely coincide with how we choose to deal with a critical situation in the region in 2021 that is intimately tied to our prosperity and security. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. And with whatever time we have left, I am very happy to answer questions.
If you would go ahead and submit questions under the question and answer icon, I'll read them and provide them to Dr. Ellis. But I'd like to start something first. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that these thoughts were your own. And for those not affiliated with a military college or university, they may not understand the academic freedoms that you have as a professor in SSI. Would you discuss that for the audience?
Sure, absolutely. It's a unique position, especially among different governments, and certainly contrasts with governments such as our Chinese friends. So Strategic Studies Institute is basically the think tank for the Chief of Staff of the Army. It is the idea is it's a trusted research institution. I work closely, for example, with Southcom, with Northcom in my capacity, with U.S. Army South, with U.S. Army North, with our teams in the region. And so, again, our institutional position gives a certain amount of trust. But the expectation is that, we are not propagandists. We are there to really look at what's happening in the region, look at what our needs are, look at questions that are important to the Army, and really provide straightforward, objective questions. And so, that means that, what I say, when I publish an article, there are really two things that are asked of me. First of all, that if I state U.S. policy, that I am stating it correctly. And second of all, of course, that I'm not putting any classified information. But above and beyond that, we have a longstanding tradition within SSI and elsewhere of being, and indeed the Chief of Staff and others want institutions like SSI to be the type of institution that speaks truth to power, that comes out and say, oh, in our professional judgment, we're not sure, or I as a scholar. And I'll be frank, there have been moments when I personally and many of my colleagues have said things that authorities in the Army and elsewhere have not found entirely enjoyable, including questioning whether our policy, DoD policy or others, is going in the right direction. But again, that is by design part of an institution like SSI, that we are on the one hand trusted to act responsibly, but that we are absolutely free, and leadership absolutely backs us up in speaking our mind. But that also means that when we speak our mind, we are not towing a party line, giving institutional position. We are giving our best responsible judgment. So in my question tonight, in my analysis of the region, again, I have that freedom. With it comes a responsibility, but it's one of the things that I think really helps. SSI is an institution that really helps us to give the Army and DoD we like to think, the honest answers that it's really looking for.
Another question. You talked about the diversion of resources to respond to the COVID epidemic. What other medical issues, diseases might flare up that could affect the United States? What you see as they just focus on COVID?
No, absolutely. And it's actually interesting. You've seen any number of diseases that have actually come out of the region. Various different tropical diseases, of course, ever-present dengue and malaria and others. But some also more exotic ones that you saw a couple of years ago that popped up even in Miami through some of the tourist contacts. And indeed, one of the concerns right now is that is so many resources are pulled away to focus on COVID and goes away from taking care of other medical needs. It actually opens up some vulnerabilities in other areas. Although there's a little bit of synergy too, but the real risk for the United States really comes from our human connectivity, because even before COVID, again, if you think about the tourism flows, the number of people that cross, for example, the U.S.-Mexican border each day, the number of people who immigrate or visit families in the region, our very connectivity means that just about all public health things that occur in the region potentially are transmitted to us. It's something that we didn't think about. We didn't take that seriously a whole lot before. I mean, SARS was one of the one. Chikungunya was another one. Forgive my horrible pronunciation. But any number of things. What happens in the region affects us.
Next question. You've been involved in the area, in the region, you said, for an extended period of time. And then you talk about Chinese action over the past months in response to COVID. How has the Chinese involvement in Latin America evolved since you first started looking at it and their involvement in that region?
Great question, and thank you very much for that. So I started looking closely at Chinese involvement in Latin America in about 2003, 2004. And at the time, very little was really known about it, and the involvement was very low. Really, China has gone through a series of different phases it's engaged in Latin America. China really, back before the opening of China to the world in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, China was involved in kind of revolutionary, disruptive type of ways. I mean, it would, broadcast Maoist revolutionary messages to indigenous populations in the Andean highlands of Bolivia and Peru and things like that. But China really had very little, certainly, business engagement and things like that. From about 1978, the Chinese economy starts opening up, but still very little actual contact in Latin America until 2001, when China joins the World Trade Organization, and you really start seeing trade with Latin America take off. I like to say that the period from 2001 to 2010 was something that I call trade without Chinese personnel, because what would happen is you had large commodity purchases. Companies like China Minmetals purchasing iron from CVRD in Brazil. Companies like China Oilseeds and Foods Corporation, COFCO, buying soy through Chicago Board of Exchange or others. And reciprocally, multilatinas or just small Latin American traders with relationships with factories in China importing goods, but really importing goods without the presence of Chinese vendors or Chinese retail complexes. But during that time, as the maturity of Chinese SOEs grew, you had growing financial ties, you had growing trade logistics ties to the region, you had growing needs by Chinese companies to export, you had growing maturity, you had growing legal and other protections. And so by the time you got to the 2008 2009 financial crisis, when Western companies were looking to get rid of their assets in Latin America to shore up their financial positions, and the Chinese were ready to move forward, you started to see a takeoff in Chinese companies. And so what was interesting then is that from about 2010, all of a sudden you start to see a real takeoff in the number of Chinese companies. A lot had just bought in, like China Minmetals or China Aluminum Corporation, Chinalco. Some had built from the ground up, like the now famous Huawei in the telecommunications sector, or ZTE. But in varying degrees, some of the early moves by those Chinese companies were very clumsy in dealing with local labor, in dealing with local governments. They got a lot of resentment and pushback. And so you actually saw a lot of social difficulties, labor protests, environmental abuses. Some companies began to get smarter in terms of how you would contract local companies, local partners. Those companies that had built a ground-up presence like Huawei, or had dealt with local partners like in automotive sector companies like Chery or SAIC, did okay. So for example, in Colombia, Huawei did a pretty reasonable job in doing smart things that other multinationals did, like sponsoring the local soccer teams, etc. But what you saw is there was kind of a learning process from about 2010. And by the time you get to about 2015, 2016, there's a certain maturity that's beginning to settle in. Now, the two things that I would say are occurring now. First of all, as China's power has expanded. I mean, there used to be an expression in China that back in the age of Deng Xiaoping, of you hide your capabilities. But with the new era of confidence with Chinese President Xi Jinping, who came to power again 2012, 2013, you see a new generation of Chinese assertiveness, a willingness to lean on Latin American governments a little, to take bolder action in terms of security engagements. You may have heard of what is called China's new wolf warrior diplomats. So when in Brazil, the Brazilian president, son of the Brazilian president, Eduardo Bolsonaro, made some pretty caustic comments against the Chinese. The Chinese diplomats in Brazil came back and said Bolsonaro was crazy. He spent too much time in Miami. He's lost his mind. So you're seeing diplomatically as well as economically a new assertiveness as well as new sophistication. Now, I firmly believe that with the COVID response, first of all, the Chinese have never done charity particularly well. And so I think the COVID response has been a little bit clumsy, but they're getting better. I think as you have a new wave of Chinese ownership, you'll see again you'll have accelerated learning, but at the same time, I think the Chinese will probably handle it a little bit better than they did the 2010 wave. But again, more assertive, more capable, but anytime you expand your footprint, it comes with greater clumsiness. But it's a great question because we often forget that nothing stays forever. People used to dismiss the quality of Japanese cars. I remember when I was a kid back in the 1970s, Honda, Toyota, they were considered, just crappy cars. And look at things today. And so in the same way, people who dismiss the sophistication of Chinese companies or the Chinese government in dealing in Latin America neglect the fact that the Chinese are learning and evolving. And as the Chinese begin to punch at their weight, because right now they're punching, frankly, below their weight in terms of their soft power influence, the already growing commercial presence will become a order of magnitude more formidable presence in terms of their influence. But great question, thank you.
Next question is, do we get substantial food supply from South America, and what impact do you see with COVID?
Absolutely, and it just depends. To a certain degree from Mexico and in other places. In some cases, so for example, Brazil with soy, we are actually competitors with Latin America. In other places like Mexico and in Central America and some of the Andean countries, we are importers. In some cases, who hasn't heard of Mexican avocados in the Super Bowl? But in some places, again, especially the Southern Cone, Chile, elsewhere, taking advantage of the flipped growing season. So when it's summer there, it's winter here. And so you get certain exports of Chilean and other fruit, Peruvian asparagus. But to date, there has not been a significant impact that I'm aware of in terms of U.S. food security. We've been fortunate to do relatively well with that. And to the best of my knowledge, although there have been some crop issues, you haven't seen that as much as you've seen an impact from the shutting down of manufacturing sectors and things like that. Ironically, what does impact things is the closure of borders. Because with the closure of borders, you impact flows that you need to get products to market. And I have heard that in many places in Latin America, so for example, in Guatemala, there was actually rioting because a lot of the food that needed to get to market couldn't get to market because of the sanitary restrictions. Individual cities and movement in the country were cut off, which stranded farmers. So we haven't seen it at the table here in the United States acutely yet, but it is an economic issue, and I think it's an evolving issue in Latin America. So certainly a great question.
Okay. For the long time, folks discussed the Monroe Doctrine as being something important in the United States. Is that doctrine a thing of the past?
It's interesting because I remember a couple of years back under the Obama administration, then Secretary of State John Kerry, I was actually there at the OAS building when Secretary Kerry announced formally the end of the Monroe Doctrine. And it was interesting because I work at Latin America. Probably within a couple of hours, I got emails from about 10 of my colleagues asking me, including my Chinese colleagues, does Secretary Kerry really mean it? So clearly that was an important step. And with the United States, one of the big changes that we saw was, with our new national security strategy, NSS, that came in 2017. There was a recognition of certain extra hemispheric state actors like China and Russia being seen as rivals. Certainly with people such as former head of the National Security Council, John Bolton, clearly a desire to formally reassert some notion of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think certainly what you've seen, especially with respect to China, and I saw this under the administration of Rex Tillerson, and certainly even more so with Secretary Pompeo, is just a real emphasis, not just in Latin America, but certainly in Latin America, among others, to really push back at some of the inroads that the Chinese have been making. But the one thing that's been different from, I would say, previous eras is that if you really look closely at the pushback, it's the United States has not been saying, don't do business with China. There's an understanding that in the current interdependent world, you just can't do that. Nor would, it's not enforceable, nor would our Latin American partners appreciate it. It would be entirely counterproductive. What you can do is to emphasize how this is a bad deal for Latin America, how, this allows basically, very sophisticated Chinese companies to take Latin American governments to the cleaners, that oftentimes the people that really benefit from these deals are, the Latin American elites who sign them and not the Latin American people. We've seen this time and time again. So the real attitude isn't, stay out of Latin America or Latin America don't do business with China. I think the real message this time around is okay, do things in a transparent way, do things from the perspective of strong institutions. And frankly, a part of that is also a concern over populist governments. And so the idea that anti-U.S. governments such as Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, or Rafael Correa previously in Ecuador, Evo Morales previously in Bolivia, really kind of open up the door to to basically hostile actors. I think there's a real desire to say, okay, let's try to have good governance in the region and try to minimize the effect of those players, because those players can allow very threatening type of behaviors in. Again, what we've seen with Venezuela right now is again, through the Maduro government, you have the Iranians coming in. You've got, of course, previously the Chinese coming in, the Russians coming in with arms and other types of support and military activities. So yes, clearly there's a reassertion of the doctrine, but it's not your grandparents' Monroe doctrine. It's Monroe for the current interdependent world that we live in. And again, when I was at State, I saw the speeches. I worked with people that actually did the secretary's speeches, and there's really, I think, an understanding that we keep emphasizing we're not doing the same. We're not asking for the same things as before, but sometimes that message gets lost. But it's a great question and often misunderstood. So thank you for the question.
We'll make this the last question before you have some closing comments. You talked about the lack of a response of government to the crisis and growing frustration. Could you see a resurgence of such groups as FARC and other regional insurgencies redevelop as a result of the COVID epidemic?
Great question. To me, the impact of COVID on organized crime is very complex. So first of all, with respect to groups such as FARC and ELN and other armed organized groups, especially in Colombia, that was taking off far before COVID. And so, part of the reason with those specific groups was the utter lack of governance in Venezuela, which meant that you not only had the effects of the Colombian 2016 accords, but you also had basically the ability of groups like the ELN to finance themselves and operate with impunity in the Venezuelan mining sector and then project themselves into Colombia. Or groups, again, such as the FARC, to be able to hide their assets in Colombia and reconstitute as basically the FARC, so to speak, FARC dissidents who have doubled in size over the past year. You had other groups who were just exploding onto the scene. I mean, in Brazil, we don't face enough the situation in Brazil. Groups like the First Capital Command, the PCC, and Comando Vermelho, a much older group, the way in which they were taking over parts of the South American drug scene. And the list just goes on and on. The question then becomes, what does COVID do to that? My sense is that it doesn't necessarily make things, it doesn't necessarily make the groups, I think it certainly contributes to the gangs. It contributes to the violence. It contributes to the struggle between groups and maybe the atomization of groups. It certainly contributes to common crime, desperation, and the ability of corrupt groups to penetrate societies. Because when governments are desperate for money, when people are lacking livelihood, if organized crime has money to throw at you and now you're out of your job, you're going to be that much more open to accepting things. So I think it does make them more vulnerable. And yet at the same time, at least in the near term, the COVID crisis makes it also strategically more difficult for those groups. They have to operate in different ways. They have to find different ways across borders. They have more limited options to move drugs and products through people. They have fewer human trafficking opportunities. So I think it's a rough balance right now. I think probably the fairest thing to say is COVID-19 really shakes up the criminal landscape, but who wins and who loses, I think, remains to be seen. But a very important question for those who follow transnational organized crime.
Any closing comments?
I think more than anything, and I just really like to circle back to what I opened with. And I think one of the things that the COVID-19 really has brought home, and it's really two things. One is that when we look at problems like this, and we had some early indications of other almost pandemics that didn't take off. But when we look at COVID, what we realize is the capacity of these threats of our modern interdependent world to transform things on a global basis. I think not only in Latin America as well as in the United States, our attitudes towards each other and our attitudes towards our vulnerabilities will never quite be the same. But I think as we look at Latin America overall, also what we're also realizing is our interdependence. And we could talk a lot about interdependence before. We could talk about, okay, when something bad happens in Central America, we have to spend, billions of dollars to stem off the tide of child migrants who come to our borders. We talked about, is this, bad in terms of poor governance in places like Mexico and how, that, suddenly is felt in terms of the fentanyl epidemic in the U.S. Midwest. So we kind of knew about interdependence, but I think really what this takes home is that interdependence is real, and if we don't manage it, it has absolutely catastrophic consequences. And again, so what I would really close on is the fact that things are, and I don't mean to be pessimistic, but things are really headed in a very, very worrisome direction in Latin America as well as obviously here in the U.S. The question then becomes that as things get bad in Latin America, how do we respond? Do we respond by building a higher, by trying to isolate ourselves more from that because, there are dangers, and, you can say, increased self-sufficiency? Do we respond by trying to reach out to an imperfect region to try to build governance institutions? And is that just an inefficient and impossible way of doing things? Do we do a combination? But we are going to face that fundamental choice. We are going to have to make that fundamental choice in early 2021 as things really start getting bad. And I think that's going to define our future relationship with the region, and in many ways, what the region itself looks like. So thank you very much. I have a group of people with whom I share my occasional publications. My email is actually on the slides. So anyone here tonight online who is interested in being part of that, please feel free to reach out to me, and I would be very happy to add you to that distro list as a vehicle for staying in touch. Thank you again for your interest and time. I wish you all the very best, and again, stay healthy and stay safe as we all continue to work through this with our homes and our families.
I want to thank you for an engaging and entertaining talk tonight. For those who did listen, I would ask you to, once I send out the notice of where this lecture is posted, I would ask you to distribute it broadly so others can hear what really is an important talk about our neighbors to the south. So again, thank you, Dr. Ellis. Thank you for everybody listening, and have a great evening. Thank you.